On September 1st, 1939, the armed forces of Germany moved into Poland, kickstarting what would become World War II. Now, I was over the age of 40, well over the age of 40, before it occurred to me to ask this question. Why did Hitler begin the war on the 1st of September 1939? Why not 6 months before? Why not in April, let's say, 1939? Or why not wait a year and start it in 1940? And I'm going to try and answer that today. I went into about a year worth of study. When it occurred to me to ask this question, I went and I hit up my network, and essentially I ran into friends of friends who were university history professors, and I asked them the same question. And to a man, they all told me, I don't know. Now, this didn't mean that they were ignorant. That's their topic of study. What it meant was, the answer is a little complicated. And from the vantage point that I have on decades of facts and learning about history, I'm on top of this mountain, right? I have all this built-in knowledge about what led up to that date. And so for me to go and spend a year, which I did, after that, digging up things, watching videos, reading stuff that they sent me to, the professors sent me to, I have come to what is a conclusion for me about why Hitler picked that date to start. And the answer will surprise you. It's a few different factors combined together. It's not all that complicated. Again, I'm saying that from my vantage point on top of the mountain. But it's not that bad. But what it consists of are things that you, as a member of the public, just don't think about very often. I'd like you to think about how food gets to your grocery store. The grocery store that you shop at. How does it get there? Do you think about this? It comes in on a truck, doesn't it? Right? And we see them. Big trailer, 40-foot trailer, comes around the back. It's unloaded, right, into their refrigerated area in the back and whatnot. And then it's stocked. The busy bees come out overnight and stock that stuff in the shelves in the front. And if you go to Walmart, you'll see these folks working there on the night shift, stocking shelves. And they got pieces of paper that tell them where to put what. It's very specific. I bet you didn't know that spots on shelves are sold in accordance with the likelihood of the customer, that's you and me going in there to buy groceries, is likely to see them. So the stuff on the top shelves sell for a low price, and the positions on the bottom shelf sell for a low price. But the stuff in the middle at eye level, that positioning goes for a premium. Oh, you didn't think the grocery store bought all that stuff, did you? And then resold it. No, no, no. They're selling that stuff on consignment, essentially. Now, when I tell you that a truck is one of, if not the least fuel-efficient, energy-efficient modes of transport, you should start thinking, wait a minute. Jason says, and it's like by a factor of 10 or more times worse than other forms of transport. Wait a minute. The food is not created in the city for the most part, is it? I mean, there are things that are churned out in factories and packaged and sent, but even they generally are not in cities. We have long since passed the era, people, of companies. I mean, if you think before the Great Depression, Black Friday, right? 1929. These folks in October of 1929 and before were in they were in La La Land financially, right? Everything was going great. It was like our pre-2008. Everybody was making money. Nobody was thinking about the future, and it was all built on a house of cards, fueled by a pack of lies. And their signal of who's doing best is who's got the tallest building inside the city. And so one company would erect one structure and be the tallest for a while, and then another would, ego-based, right, build another one that was a little bit taller, 20 feet higher, you know. And have you noticed we don't do this anymore? Oh, sure, there are large buildings being created around the world, but it's not a measuring contest anymore, right? Why do you think that happened? There's been a shift in thinking. There's been a paradigm shift in thinking since the Great Depression about how to place our campuses, how to place our buildings. What we do now is we place them outside of town. We create a campus in the wilderness outside of town where land is cheap. That is what changed. Real estate. Understanding the value of real estate and changing thinking about what do we value. Do we want to have a stick measuring contest in town about who's got the tallest building? Or do we want to build lower, flatter, bigger buildings outside of town where it's so much cheaper and we have plenty of available land? And we have control. Why am I getting into this? Because it's an example of this paradigm thinking that you don't really think about. This major shift happened. Oh, Jason, I wasn't alive in 1939 or 1929 or whatever, right? I get that. It's an example. Let's look at it. Let's use it. So when I tell you that trucks are extremely fuel inefficient, it's not a good way to actually transport things unless you have to. Well, and we start thinking about, well, how does food get from those campuses where it's made, and that could be a farm, it could be a factory, outside of cities, into cities? Well, trains are what's used. Trains are extremely efficient in terms of BTUs used per unit of content moved. That's a big deal. Trains. None of you think about trains. I almost went into the train business coming out of college. There's a transportation management trainee thing where you would go to work for like Union Pacific or Norfolk Southern and travel around on trains for a year basically and learn. It's inside, outside, lots of outside, bad weather job. Train signals, connecting trains, making sure the signals and the markings are right. It was a big job. Unfortunately, at the time, I'm Canadian, right? I was born in North Vancouver, so I didn't want to move to the U.S. I think if they had offered me that in 1997, I probably would have taken it, but they didn't. The economy was doing okay, but they were interested in American candidates at the time, and despite me sending them a very nice, one of my briefs, if you've ever heard me talk about that, it's a booklet that I made out of Think and Grow Rich, and that got me custom-made jobs 4 times in my life. But to a big company like Norfolk Southern, they don't give a damn. They want to see the standard, kind of resume that everybody else gives them, so that their computers could probably work on it. But that being neither here nor there, trains are very efficient, and they are the way that your foodstuff gets from the campuses outside cities where they're made into the cities to a distribution center. And they go from that warehouse by truck to the back door of your local supermarket. Okay? I just educated you about something called logistics. Logistics. The train is a better use for your fuel than trucks moving the same amount of food by a ton. Again, probably 100 times better than moving all that stuff by truck, maybe more. Again, you have not thought about this before. I know you haven't. So, the moral of the story there is if we can move stuff by train rather than by truck, wouldn't we want to do that? Yeah. Why? Well, because fuel is a limited resource. Oh yeah. Again, something you don't normally think about. I can tell you that in grade 11 and 12, when we were talking, and in college, when we were talking about tanks rolling across the French countryside or trucks of the Wehrmacht rolling into the Soviet Union in 1941, I was not thinking about fuel. I was just seeing the vehicles running in my head and thinking, oh yeah, they go wherever the generals send them, right? Right? Don't they? They can just go anywhere. They can keep going as long as they want, don't they? Like, it never occurred to me to ask, well, what about fuel supply? What about logistics? That thought never occurred to me. And, it's kind of arrogant to say, well, if it never occurred to me, it never occurred to anybody else. But I guarantee it didn't occur to very many other people. It's just not how we're wired to think. We get a picture served to us, and we adopt that picture without any criticism or critical thinking of it. Okay. So why World War II? Why did it happen? Why September 1st, 1939? Fuel is a major factor. That's the first thing that I learned. And we're going to talk in detail about that. But there are other factors. And one of them is purely emotional. I'm going to tell you about some stuff that's going to blow your mind. I know because I've shared it with some people who are friends of mine, and it blew their minds. They were like, holy cow, I had no idea. We tend to think of the Soviet Union and the Nazis as enemies, if you know anything about World War II at all, which many people don't. And if you don't, you're probably not listening to this. So, but you might be surprised to hear that during the 20s and 30s, Germany and the USSR were friends. Not walk hand in hand in the park friendly, but working together friendly. Because they were kind of the outsiders of the international community, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so, hey. And we're going to hear about how those two hooked up and how it also led to this date being chosen as the start of World War II for the Germans. To understand the emotional beginning of World War II, we have to go back to World War I. And that's fine with me because World War I will flat out tell you now, World War I is the cause of everything that we see today. Everything. The mess in the Middle East, World War I and its resulting treaties. Drawing a line through the desert because it's a cool diagonal line without regard to the people living there. Well, you're on this half. Oh, your group's also on this other half. Oh, look, they're getting gassed. This is not good. Sorry, Armenians and other folks who live there. Sorry, Kurds. Sorry, you don't get a homeland. You get split up and gassed. Before World War I, pre-September 1914, the world was very different. The United States was growing as an economic powerhouse, very much so. It had tested the waters with the new industrial and military, I won't call it might yet, but it was flexing its muscles in a couple of conflicts. Philippines, fight with Spain. The Philippines was a colony. War in Cuba, same thing. But this war, World War I, was the one where America transformed into the military juggernaut that we just have this expectation about today. Like, duh, oh yeah. Well, before that, it was a much more agrarian society, some industrialization in the north. But it was not what we picture today. Post-World War I, much closer to what we are expecting. Europe was divided into several armed camps, two major ones, alliances on either side. Now, I'm going to take an aside here for a moment and give my opinion that the unification of Germany, which came out of the Holy Roman Empire and a bunch of city-states, basically, little kingdoms, little city-states and that, suddenly roped together by Bismarck in 1870-71. Bing! Suddenly you got this new economic powerhouse in the center of Europe. And I will tell you, anytime you want to see conflict, you go look for this in history. An old military power and a new economic power. When you see this, there will be war. In this case, World War I, the old power is England. Britannia rules the waves. Covers a ridiculous amount of territory on the globe with its colonies. Germany, new, upstart, confident buggers. They will walk around. I mean, Americans get blamed for or accused of the same kind of stuff that these new Germans did back in 1870. Popping up on the world stage and expecting to be taken seriously by the grand old men of Europe who have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Who are you to tell us And what the economic power, the new economic power does is attempt to convert much of its economic might into military might as fast as it can. Now Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, was a German statesman who was a genius, and he ran this system, this diplomatic system that pretty much only he understood. And after he was dismissed and then died, nobody else understood it, and it careened off into instability and crashed into the war, starting in 1914. Why was that system in place in the first place? We have to go back a little bit farther. Now, I happen to think that the unification of Germany is quite possibly the worst idea in the last 200 years, because look what it led to. It led to empires blowing up, ancient empires blowing up. Austria-Hungary, Turkey, Russia, the Russian Empire, gone. Replaced by this new thing, the Soviet Union. What the heck is that? Food for thought. We'll come back to that later probably. But we have to go back to Napoleon. This is around 1800. Holy crap, Jason, you're taking us back a long time to get to September 1st, 1939. Yeah! The seeds of World War I and World War II are contained in the treaties of Paris, 1814, 1815. They are there. And I'm not going to go into this technical rigor of ridiculous levels of analysis. I'm just going to show you a few key things, like how do the foodstuffs get to your local grocery store, that are going to open up your mind, okay? Stuff you have never thought about. There is a wonderful area in Northern Europe, or Central Europe, a little more towards the west, I guess, that's filled with beautiful rolling hills. They're not that high, they're not rocky, and they just seem to be made for fighting. They're perfect for it. And this area was in northern France early on, I mean pre-1800, you know, and it's just this wonderful little area for traversing armies east to west or west to east. And this has happened many times. Napoleon sent armies through there to the east. He went to invade first the Germanic principalities, the Holy Roman Empire, and then Russia. And then it has been invaded to the west by Germany twice. First at the beginning of World War I. You may have heard of the Schlieffen Plan. We could talk about that at length. Maybe we will. I don't know yet. And in World War II. And in fact, it was the knowledge that, of course, the Germans are going to come through this area again that caused the French to move the majority of their forces up there and become outflanked. When the Germans came through the Ardennes forest to the south, which was impassable. Everybody knows it's impassable except the Germans, who brought tanks through it, outflanked the French and knocked them out in a few weeks. That's how the French got beaten in World War II. But that's after the point that we're talking about, September 1st, 1939. Okay, so we got this little rolling hills area that's a lovely highway for armies to go east to west. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1814, 1815, the great powers got together in Paris and came up with an agreement. It was called the Concert of Europe. Doesn't that sound lovely? Austria, where's your oboe? The Concert of Europe means that we won't fight major wars in Europe. If we want to fight, we will come to a diplomatic solution and we will take out and vent our anger in our colonies with smaller forces far away from the homeland. Because we don't need this again. Wars through the home countries are devastating. That is clear, right? It knocks out the economic power of that area for a while. They have to rebuild, right? I mean, let's face it, artillery takes out buildings and kills populations. That's not good. So, we don't want that anymore. In order to ensure that no one ever uses this lovely rolling hill highway for armies to go east to west or west to east ever again, the signatories of the treaties of Paris do this thing. They create, bing, out of nowhere, magic wand, pop, there it is. Out of nowhere, they create a kingdom of Belgium. And they guarantee its neutrality. with a defensive pact. The defensive pact says, essentially, look, if you invade Belgium, all the rest of us are going to gang up on you. Simple enough, right? If there's this lovely piece of land to move armies around in, we're going to deny it to everyone. Sounds good, right? Okay. So Belgium is there. It gets involved in the Congo as its colonies, and I've talked about this in another episode where I get into perverse incentives. Some of the stuff they did there was absolutely horrifying. And I'm not overblowing that word. It's horrifying. But the key thing to take away here is the guaranteed neutrality of Belgium. That is the key for understanding the beginning of World War I. And the key to understanding World War II is through World War I. So that's why we've gone back 200 years to get to this. Understand that Belgium is key. It's this little knobby thing in the center that people keep invading, and that turns on the armed forces of all these countries and triggers the wars. This concert of Europe is so effective, it works for 99 years. That's pretty darn good. We're in a period sometimes termed the Long Peace now, after the end of World War II. And we're used to it. Even though the world is at war most of the time, it has been at general war a lot more often prior to the treaties of Paris 1814, 1815 than it has been after. In other words, this treaty was pretty darn good. 99 years. And that's with the upstart Germany appearing suddenly at the end of that time, in 1870, and Bismarck creating his system of alliances, which was centered by don't get isolated from Russia. Make sure Russia is your partner. Russia and somebody else. If you can get more, great, but you got to have Russia. Russia's this great bear of Europe, they call it, right? They also call it the Russian steamroller. Yeah, it's going to take them a long time to mobilize. That means get your guys from their farms to report to mobilization stations, to get on trains and form their units up and get them to the front. Everybody was expecting this to take a long time, weeks and weeks for the Russians. Whereas France and Germany and that had more efficient schedules and trains and stuff, and they could get them there faster. This is key to the German planning, by the way. The beginning of World War I, and you'll see this again if you study history, the stuff that we were taught in high school is a gross oversimplification, and in fact, just kind of plain wrong. If I can knock that idea into you today, that would be a victory. The perspective that we are shown and taught and the pictures we're shown are just wrong. I'm not saying vast conspiracy. I'm saying the histories are written by the victors. And they polish themselves up to appear in the best possible light, and they make their enemies out to be the worst demons possible, right? Does that make sense? And so the historical perspective is skewed. Now, the stuff that we were taught about the beginning of World War I, it's a system of alliances, and they want to mobilize, and there's this assassination in Sarajevo, and the Austrians go and ask the Germans for help against Serbia, and Germany gives them this so-called blank check. Yeah, do what you want. But if Austria invades Serbia, it's going to pull in the Russians, and that system of alliances is going to create general war. What? Okay. It's complex. What I just described was the general idea, but when you dig into it more, I will tell you, having dug into it, it gets slushy. Boy, does it get slushy fast. Barbara Tuchman wrote a great book called The Guns of August. I read it about every year to remind me how crazy this stuff is. Things happened like the Russians mobilized way faster than anybody thought and got all these guys to the front, but they didn't have enough equipment. And then they get into Eastern Prussia, and two armies get destroyed by the Germans. And the Russian general goes off into a swamp and shoots himself in the head because he doesn't want to go back to his czar. I mean, when you're reading about this stuff, it's like, geez. It would have been better for the Russians to have mobilized at the slow pace everybody expected them to, rather than rush out there just because they could, sort of half-cocked and smashed. Whoops. It's wild. Anyway, so since then, I've watched a bunch of lectures by historians and professors and generals on these topics, and I found out that some of the stuff that Tuchman talks about in The Guns of August, it's not wrong, but sometimes it's in the wrong order. Like, she'll say this guy was talking to that guy, and this person over here was talking to that guy, and the days will be out by, like, say 3 days, 4 days. This didn't happen until after that, but she says it happened before. And so this isn't to discredit The Guns of August. I love that book. However, it is a major point that stuff did not occur in the order that she says it does all the time. And that means in other histories, same thing. Everything gets slushy. There was a time right before the General War started when Germany knew this was coming. Germany knew this war was coming, and they had their planners. Remember what I said about the young upstart economic nation versus the old powerful military nation, right? They knew this was coming. Germany and England were in a naval arms race. Who can build these dreadnought-class ships the fastest? And they're pissed off at each other. But Germany really respects England. The royal house of England is German. I don't think people know this. The Windsors are German. They changed their frickin' name. They spoke German at home. They're German. And everybody in that royal circle prior to the World War I, they were all relatives. The Kaiser was, I think, the grandson of the Queen of England. Nicky, the Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, was his cousin. Right? I mean, France was a democratic republic at the time. So it doesn't get included in this. But all this stuff is intertwined. This is like a family squabble that, because they have nation states and the arms to go with it and the logistics to power it, turns into this millions upon millions of pounding, killing thing, right? It's this event, like, whoa. And I've thought about this in modern times too. Like, what if President Bush II and Osama bin Laden were having a squabble? And that created September 11th. Oh, I'm going to ruin your presidency, George. Bam, bam. Whatever conspiracy theories or whatever, this is just hypothetical, as an aside. Right? But if you're the President of the United States, you have a State Department. That State Department has analysts. Those analysts will write position papers. Paul Wolfowitz will write position papers as a security analyst. And now you've got legitimacy. It's not a family squabble anymore. It's the State Department. It's defense. We have oomph behind it. We have legitimacy. Now we're going to war. What? So same thing. Take this back to World War I. Now, again, Germany knew that this war was coming, and they would raise a glass to Der Tag, the day that we as Germans are going to beat the snot out of the world and we'll show them how great we are. And the society got organized for that. They had the war machine built up, they had the armed forces built up, the General Staff College, they had the plan. The Schlieffen Plan was designed very early on. I'm not going to get into specific dates. You can go to Wikipedia or somewhere and look it up yourself. But this plan was started by some people and then added on to and shifted by others. And the plan was this. Look, if we've got a hated nation that we beat in 1870-71, by the way, France, that knocked out the Napoleon III and this empire and knocked it back into being a democratic republic. And we took over some territory, said the Germans. We did that. And Britain and France and Russia are friends. That's the one alliance, encircling Germany. Germany would always complain about encirclement, and people would scoff at it from outside. But if you look at it from the German perspective, they really are encircled, and their friends are Austria-Hungary to their south. Common border, common language, common rail system. It's kind of a natural. And then Italy was the niggling thing in the middle that actually switched sides in the conflict. Horrible people, as Ralph Raico said, running Italy at the time. Germany had disassociated itself from Russia with the end of Otto von Bismarck and the rise of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had been around for quite some time now, 20, 25 years, something like that, running the thing. And it's sad because his dad was a liberal, and if that guy had lived, Willie would not have been on the throne, probably, and the whole thing might have been different. Unfortunately, Willie's dad had throat cancer and died after not many days. I think 90 days of rule. Wasn't very long. So Willie gets in, and Willie's first statement is not to his people, but to my army. What do you think the theme of this administration is going to be about? Okay. So Germany has done the thing that Otto von Bismarck said not to do, separated itself from Russia and gotten encircled by Russia, England, and France in a defensive alliance. You attack one of us, we're all coming after you. Germany is preparing for Der Tag, the day, and the plan is the Schlieffen Plan, which says we know France is over there, even though we're not fighting France. We have no quarrel with France right now, but they're in the alliance, so we have to knock them out. And we know they're going to mobilize faster than the Russian bear, right? The Russian steamroller. We talked about this. Okay? So our plan is to use our fantastic rail system, logistics, again, rail. Remember what I said about the BTUs, right? The fuel use. We will take the majority of our armies and send them to knock out France first. Then we will use that rail system again to zip all of our armies to the east and meet the Russian steamroller and annihilate them. And the plan was the Schlieffen Plan, which is we'll go not along the fortified border with France. We'll come in through the north. We'll go in through Holland and Belgium. And they really thought, the Germans really thought, Britain would do nothing. And I'll tell you the truth from what I have learned from research. Britain almost did nothing. I will tell you, it was common practice for these diplomats to sign treaties saying, oh yeah, we'll guarantee the neutrality of this country and that. And then when the time for the decision came around to go, well, you know, that's just writing on a piece of paper and not to follow it. Not to follow the terms. So for anybody to say, well, this was an ironclad agreement and Britain had to get involved when Belgium was invaded, that is not true. That is one of those gross oversimplifications that I was talking about. It's not true. They ignored these clauses all the time when it was convenient to their interests. This is a world of realpolitik. That means getting power and denying power to your enemies. Something people don't think about. Realpolitik is the great game, grand strategy. How are we going to get power and deny it to others? And so in World War II, we'll see it's the age of ideologies. Nazism versus Soviet communism versus the democracy. You know, that's baloney. That's baloney. That is window dressing. It is a world of realpolitik, and we will see it. And that's why you will see people do things that look against the ideology and go, why? That doesn't make any sense. Well, look at it from a realpolitik perspective, and you will see what they are doing. Our politics today is no different. You will see Democrats and Republicans all mouthing these words about ideology, but when it comes down to it, they're all realpolitik people. And so they will do things that look really weird. Look behind the veil. It's a realpolitik thing. They are getting power or denying it to others, or both. Germany, knowing this, and is backing up Austria-Hungary, remember? Who had Franz Josef II assassinated with his wife. That's a whole story in itself. You should listen to Dan Carlin's podcast, even if you only listen to the first 20 minutes on Hardcore History, his podcast of Blueprint for Armageddon. Amazing. It's like 23 hours. I consider myself really good on World War I, and I learned a lot. I mean, it was fun, too. Even just hitting the points that I already knew and hearing Dan describe them was amazing. Okay. He has an opening that talks about that assassination as if it was the Kennedy assassination, only imagine the assassin Mrs. Kennedy on the first try coming over, to the grassy knoll on that overpass, which I've been to. And like a couple hours later, they come back. They return to the same spot, the president's motorcade in an open car. And the assassin is still there and goes, "Oh my gosh, what a chance has been gifted to me by the gods, by history." Bam, bam. Now, as Tuckman says, this problem could have been solved by a double funeral, quietly done. But no. The Austrians, doing realpolitik, decide to turn this into a big international incident to try and knock out Serbia, their rising rival to the south. Oh, old military power, rising new economic power. Here it is again. Austria, Hungary, and Serbia. Oh. And so they give Serbia an ultimatum with terms that are pretty much impossible. No one would agree to them. Nobody could agree to this. And the Serbians actually agree to most of them, surprisingly. They're like showing the world, like, look, we're really trying to resolve this. We're going to eat some humble pie here, some unpleasant stuff. Okay, we'll do it. No, you're not doing all of it, so we're going to invade. Germany, we're doing that blank check thing, right? You're going to back us up, right? Yup. Well, and then Kaiser Wilhelm says, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, I don't really want to. But that message does not get communicated to the Austrian leadership. That telegram gets intercepted by an Austrian officer and tucked away. We'll just lose that for a couple days. Oh, the war's on. This is what I'm talking about things getting very slushy and people talking to each other and not reported or recorded by historians in the right order. Okay? Right before the war started, the German diplomat Bethmann Hollweg was like walking around losing his mind, basically, wondering whether Britain was going to get involved or not. That's how close it was. It wasn't like Britain said, "Oh, we're getting involved. We're doing this. Get out of there." That's not what happened. And yet people just skip past this stuff and think, oh, well. So, since Germany knows that in order to fight this war with Russia, to defend their pal, Austria-Hungary, that they're in this agreement with, this alliance, they have to first go knock out France. And the way they're going to do that is go through Belgium, which was, guaranteed neutrality by the treaties of Paris, 1814, 1815. Now what? Knock out France and then turn around and go fight the Russian bear. And so they tell everyone. They go tell the Belgians, hey, look, we're just marching through. Give us the keys to your fortifications and we'll give them back after the war. Just let us through. We're going to walk through. We're not going to do anything. We're going to fight France. Just leave us alone and it'll be fine. And they tell everyone else that too. Look, we're going through Belgium. And this was after they'd already committed. And again, the descriptions of these armies of gray soldiers is just astounding. Like they walk by a spot. There's an American journalist sitting at a cafe in a Belgian town, and he's watching the German troops go by, and they're walking all day. They go by, and there's no sign of this snake ending. This snake of men. And the kitchens would come first and set up way stations so that people would get fed. It was all planned out, logistics, to this massive detail about how they were going to do it. Unfortunately, the Belgians and their kings say, nope, we're going to resist. Even though they know they're going to get smoked, they know they're going to lose. But they fight anyway. And so the ultimatum comes from England to Germany, hey, get out of Belgium, or else. And the Germans can't believe it. They're like, what, you're going to go to war for this? This has nothing to do with you. Stay out. Stay over there. Cross the channel. Leave it alone. We'll talk with you after it's over. I can't believe you're actually going to go to war for this. It's not possible. And so they keep going. And the decision is finally made. And Lloyd George says, I saw the lights going out all over Europe, right? And what he meant was the financial lights, the investment banks and trading and all that. I got knocked out. the empires never recovered from this. The British Empire in particular was top of the world economically before that. So here we have Belgium being the key to the start of World War I. So if you don't know the story, it gets bogged down. The Schlieffen Plan doesn't really work. They get into northern France, but there's an army there to meet them, and they get bogged down. They fight all of them to this level called the Marne. It's a river. There's a thing called the Miracle of the Marne, where things were very seesaw for a few days, but the French managed to hold the line. You know Gandalf in Lord of the Rings when he's in Moria on the bridge and he shouts at the Balrog, "You shall not pass"? That is stripped directly from the Marne, the Battle of the Marne. That was the motto of the French soldiers at the Marne. Ils ne passeront pas. You shall not pass. They shall not pass. And Tolkien was in that war, so he knew. It gets bogged down into trench warfare for 4 years. The War of Mobility turns into a stagnant war. And in the east, the Russians gradually wear themselves out trying to fight the Germans. And finally, the Tsar abdicates and is taken hostage, basically, by the Soviets, who then murder him and his family later on because they do not want to see a restoration of imperial power ever. Realpolitik, denial of power to your enemies. If you murder them, there's no one left to take the crown. Soviet experiment works for 80-odd years. When I say that World War I was the most important thing in our age, in the last 200 years, this is why. It led to the full industrialization and military power of the United States as we see it today. It led to the rise of the Soviet Union, leading to, eventually, the Cold War. It led to all the mess in the Middle East. It led to the view of the world that we see today. I think you could argue with me and sprinkle in nuclear weapons in there and whatnot, and you'd have a point. That's also a major alteration to our point of view. But what we see and what we expect has been going on since then, that time. Now, Germany in 1918 surrenders. The Kaiser abdicates. The two guys, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who have been the military commanders, basically dictators of the country for the last year or so, give up also. But Germany has surrendered with its soldiers in enemy territory. This is the first time in history this has ever happened. As far as I can tell, it's very rare, if not never before. You don't surrender when you're in the enemy's territory. And this is sometimes called the stab in the back. That term has also been applied to the Italians switching sides during the war. But the German people, in general, believe that their diplomats stabbed them in the back, that they surrendered when they didn't have to. This is, of course, wrong. But again, if you're looking at it from a purely emotional or ideological perspective, you will not understand. Germany had been cut off for trade by Britain and British fleet. No food. The people were eating sawdust in their bread. They're doing, can you even imagine that? Let's put sawdust in our bread and eat that. Can you even imagine that? I can't really imagine how that would even work. I mean, what do you take it and dump it in the bowl that you're mixing the dough in, or what? Imagine decisions like this. I don't even know how to extrapolate that into my own life. It would be so different from what we're doing. So anyway, Germany had been starved out. It was exhausted. They just weren't getting anywhere with their offensives, and it was time. They just knew, okay, we got to surrender now. So they did. But, so this treaty that they signed, another treaty, this one at Versailles, has something called the War Guilt Clause. And the War Guilt Clause is an agreement by Germany that they started the war, that they are responsible for the war starting. Now, if you've been listening to everything I've been saying so far, you'll know that's a crock of you-know-what. Blaming Germany for the start of that war, you could blame any of the great powers. You could blame Russia. Russia, at the very beginning of World War I, started to mobilize. And then Nicky got on the phone and said, no, wait, turn it off. I don't want to freak the Germans out. because the timetables were so exacting that if they mobilized, you would have to mobilize. Otherwise, you'd be out of sync and it would be bad, right? So the moment your enemy starts to mobilize, you have to mobilize. Then his advisors, Nicholas II's advisors, get him to agree to turn mobilization back on, and the general in charge smashes the phone. He says, I smashed the phone to make sure that he wouldn't have a chance to get a signal out to turn it off again. Be wishy-washy. Okay? So you could apply the war guilt clause to them. You can make a case for it for just about any power. But Germany gets stuck with this war guilt clause, having to give up territory and have to pay millions and millions of marks, German marks, not dollars, you understand, or pounds sterling, or francs, marks. This is key, actually. To France and the victors, who would come in and actually strip off out of German factories their machinery, carry them back to their home countries and install them there. Well, that sounds like a good idea, doesn't it? Hey, we get all their cool stuff. I mean, German machining is really good. And if you want to make war machines, you need good machine tools. There's just one problem with that. This is a second-order consequence, an unanticipated thing. If you take away the machinery of one nation, what are they going to have to do? They're going to have to, as a natural development, replace that stuff, that equipment. What are they going to replace it with? Old stuff? No, they're going to replace it with the latest and greatest technology. And so now you have a German state that is remechanized with brand new machine tools, whereas their opponents are stuck with the old stuff that they stole. That's just one little tidbit factor going on in the background, but it's fun to think about. Germany gets turned into something called the Weimar Republic. Weimar is a town in Germany that served as the capital. And Weimar is just hated, and the diplomats were hated. And you got to understand, there's assassinations going on here. This is the level of hate that the German people have for their Weimar leaders right now. 1920, 21, 22, 23. And the German economy is in the tank. It's bad. Now, several things go on with Weimar that the Nazis continued. Okay? I mean, the Nazis are not even on the horizon yet. Hitler's there. Hitler is one of these disillusioned, disenfranchised. He was actually an Austrian who came to live in Germany and then served in the German armed forces when World War I came on. He was a soldier in World War I. He had seen poison gas. That's why you don't see poison gas in World War II. He had been gassed himself and blinded and recovered. And he didn't want to subject anyone to that. What a great guy. And he'd come out and gotten hired by the Weimar Republic, the intelligence service, to spy on radical political groups popping up and report back. And he joined this thing called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which in German has the initials NDSAP. It was a little group, and Hitler ended up taking it over. And his rise is one of the most fascinating stories of a rags to riches, of a guy who had nothing, who came to the top of world power. It's amazing. We all hate the guy. But it is really something to watch this meteoric rise from kind of a dull guy, a failed artist, guy who'd been a soldier, he'd been down on his luck, he'd been homeless in Austria. Life was not good to him. And then to suddenly get woken up and have those extra engines or battery powers that he had for speech making get turned on by this hatred and resentment of what happened with the Treaty of Versailles and the War Guilt Clause and the fact that Germany was stuck with the bill for all these reparation payments. Well, he was not the only one. We know this. When he spoke, and he was involved in politics since the 20s in Germany, when he spoke and started getting people riled up, they already believed what he was telling them about. He was reflecting and amplifying the feelings that they had. And that's why you get these ardent Nazis, why they're so emotionally wound up. This is what they were pushing against, was their hatred of this Versailles Treaty and the situation, the humiliation that their country had been put into. And they, remember, did not understand logistics. They did not understand, hey, we were beaten. They went, no, we were stabbed in the back, and our crappy leaders made us sign this crappy treaty and put us on the hook. So inflation's going wild in Germany as well. You know, you get this picture of people bringing in German marks in wheelbarrows full for a loaf of bread. I mean, it was ridiculous. The middle class gets their savings wiped out. No wonder they were willing to listen to the fringes for leaders. The current ones weren't doing very well. But anyway, let's get back to Weimar. 1919. You're not allowed to have a general staff, which is like the army officer training school. You're only allowed to have an army of 100,000 people. They had had millions, just like everybody else in Europe to that point. Millions person's army. 100,000. You're not allowed to build these classes of ships. You're not allowed to have tanks. You're not allowed to have airplanes. What the? Okay? You're not really allowed to have anything except local militias and internal police forces. Well, how the hell do you get around that if you're Germany, if you're the Weimar Republic? So a lot of the stuff that the Nazis get credit for, Weimar started. And this, again, is a result of the digging, the stuff you find out. Remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and we've got this thing called the Soviet Union over there. And Poland's history is astounding. Go to the Wikipedia article and look at that. It like appears and disappears from history and reappears again like a ghost. It's the craziest thing. It changes shape. It moves. It was in a commonwealth with Lithuania not too long ago. It's the strangest thing. And Lithuania was like a world power at the time, kind of, for that area, for Europe. Wiped out of existence, partitioned 3 times, brought back by Napoleon as a border state, legitimized, pop, suddenly. And this is important. Poland is big in this post-World War I era. 1919, 1920. Poland is big, and it's right on the edge of Germany in the east, and there's Russia on the other side, the Soviet Union now. And the Soviet Union, it's important to understand, they only controlled the area around Moscow and St. Petersburg and that. They had to take all that territory back. So for years, to the east and to the west, they're fighting. They're fighting a civil war, and other countries are throwing people in. British, American troops are showing up in the former Russian territories to fight against the Soviets. You probably didn't know about that. Imagine if that was happening here. How pissed off would you be about foreign intervention if that happened here? So try to look at things from the Soviet point of view sometime, okay? Were they great people? No. Did they murder people? Yeah, by the zillions. But you can understand why they were not too happy about other countries sending people in to fight in their territory to try and depose them and restore a monarchy. Okay. Enemy of my enemy is my friend. So Weimar goes to the Soviet Union and says, hey, psst, can we make a deal with you? We're not allowed to have an armed forces over 100,000 people or train officers or have a general staff college. We're not allowed to have a war school. Can we do that on your territory? It's like the French and the English and the Americans, they're looking at us, but they aren't looking at you. Can you give us some territory in there? We'll like rent it from you, you know, and we'll try out some stuff. We'll train our... You know what they did? The agreement they eventually got to was that German officers would become Soviet officers for a while. They'd go across the border and they'd get into Soviet uniforms and become of that rank. And then later on, when they came back to Germany, they'd pick up where they left off, but now at the equivalent rank that they had achieved. And so in the Soviet Union, they were allowed to train. They were allowed to play with tanks. They were allowed to play with airplanes. They were allowed to do stuff, train more officers. All this stuff is happening in secret. What do the Soviets get out of it? Well, the Soviets need to feed people and also give raw materials. So there was a lot of trade going back and forth between these guys. Now, Poland is an interesting case in the middle. And you'll recall, September 1st, 1939, the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany. This is the whole point of what I've been talking about leading up to here. Why did this happen? Poland is in the middle. And it's big. The Soviets try to invade Poland. It doesn't go very well. Trotsky's pissed off at Stalin because Stalin shows up late for this battle, and so they lose and get out of there and whatnot. And funny story, many of the Soviet leadership, when it came down, when Lenin died, and it came down to a fight between Trotsky and Stalin, didn't go for Trotsky because Trotsky looked more like Napoleon. Like, that's got to be the dumbest reason ever, and yet it's valid. It happened. People didn't support Trotsky, who was the smarter, I guess, more genius. I mean, Trotsky was the guy who went around on all the trains during the Civil War, visiting armies and pumping them up, giving them the motivational speech, telling them about strategy, right? It's his quote. You may not be interested in strategy, but strategy is interested in you. But anyway, that's how dumb and distracted people get. I mean, you look more like Napoleon, so I'm not going to vote for you, right? I'm not going to, it's crazy. But it happened. Anyway, so the Germans are getting around the arms treaty by training in Russia, in the Soviet Union. How do they get around the reparations, which they paid off in record time? They made it a policy. This is Weimar now, not Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany came later in the 30s. We're still in the 20s here. Secret policy of inflation. Remember I said there was inflation? Weimar did it to themselves. Remember I said that the repayments were to be in so many German marks? So they just inflated the German mark. They blew up their own currency so that they could pay more of the marks off faster. And they blamed it on outsiders. They blamed it on the economy. They blamed it on Versailles. A horrible treaty which all of us hate. Don't look at us. We're just trying to run the country and do the best we can. Secret policy of inflation. Because we could have paid off 10,000, but we paid off 100,000 thanks to inflation. You see how the pace increases here? This is wild. Okay, now I found out about the secret inflation many years ago, 15, 20 years ago. That wasn't hidden too much, but the secret arms training facilities, that was new to me. Didn't know about that. Interesting case going on now. Back to Poland. Poland is like this pretty girl that has two suitors named Germany and the Soviet Union. And they keep cuddling up to her. You want to be my girlfriend? Well, do you want to be my girlfriend? I'm much more handsome than he is. And Poland's policy is to remain neutral and not snuggle up to either side. So they keep saying, no, we don't want to fight with you. We don't want to fight with anybody. We just want to be here. Okay? And the Polish people are very industrious. They had that reputation, the Polish submarine with screen doors, that kind of joke, as being stupid. And I don't understand why or where that came from. Probably because they got beaten in this opening part of World War II. And, well, it's pretty obvious why. Numbers, strategy, and equipment are totally lopsided in favor of the Germans. It's not much of a surprise. Poland's repeatedly getting these overtures from the Soviets and Germany to get into an alliance of some kind with them, defensive or offensive. And they keep saying no, and this is the stuff that I discovered in the last year through my study. The 30s come, and Hitler finally gets to power. Hitler comes to power in 1933. Weimar has done its work. It's moved the General Staff College or the War College to the Soviet Union. It's got people getting trained and playing around with good equipment there. And it's got the trade set up so that the nation's getting supplied and is doing pretty okay. I mean, you got to understand, Germany cannot feed itself. It's just like Japan in a sense. Japan is clearer because it's on an island. Japan couldn't feed itself. And when you dig into the history of that too, you'll discover that the stuff you were taught about history and Pearl Harbor and that is not quite the way it was taught to you. The Americans isolated Japan and made it impossible for them to buy oil unless you submit. What do you think they're going to do in that situation? And that's not being an apologist for the Japanese. It's saying, if you shove somebody into a corner and leave them no way out, what do you expect is going to happen? Anyway, all the way up through to early 1939, February, April 1939, Hitler is talking to Poland. And he actually had, there was a kind of a folk hero, general kind of dictator of Poland who died, and Hitler went to his funeral. He admired the guy. He didn't regard the Poles as subhuman, to get into the ideology for a second. But after that, now, you see Poland's leadership changed, the quality of the leadership changed from Hitler's perspective. They were no longer people he could ever really deal with. And this latest overture gets denied again in early 1939. Do you see how close this is to the invasion date? Hitler clearly snapped and made a decision here. Okay, so this is one major factor about why this war started on September 1st, 1939. They could not get a deal with the Poles, which were a much bigger nation than the one today, more powerful, more people relative to the populations of the neighboring countries, and that much better friend to have at the time, right? Geopolitically, realpolitik-wise. And he knows he's not going to get the agreement. And I believe this is a major pressure on making this decision. It's not the only one, it's just one of them. So that's where we'll start. Poland. Not going to get the agreement. Not going to get a treaty. You'll note how this interdependence between the Soviet Union and Germany is going on, right? Training our guys over there, we're trading partners. Why would they go to war? Well, Hitler published this book called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, when he was in jail. He was in jail for a couple years for trying to depose the state, and they had this show trial that was this amazing public relations thing that only turned out well for him. Where you think, like, Weimar could have had him shot for this beer hall pooch thing, trying to overthrow the government in Bavaria, right? They could have ended it there, but they don't. Instead, they're like, well, this guy's kind of a public figure, and we don't want to nuke him. And, well, they didn't have nukes yet, but, we don't want to kill him. Let's just put him on trial and throw him in jail for a couple years, and hopefully he'll learn his lesson and be a good boy. Well, he does not be a good boy. He writes his book in which he outlays the entire thing. Now, all the eugenic stuff, all the shape of the head and all that stuff, telling you about the personality, or Slavs are stupid, they have sloping foreheads, that kind of thing, right? All that is not Nazi stuff. That stuff existed, that's pre-1900s standard quackery medical theory. That stuff was widespread. Everybody in Hitler's generation pretty much had that point of view. That's an exaggeration, but it'll suffice. Okay? It was a pretty common point of view. So he didn't make that stuff up. That's not purely Nazi stuff. That's just imperialist thinking, colonial, arrogant thinking. But what he does come up with in Mein Kampf is, I hate the Soviets. Germany needs room for its people, so here's what we're going to do. Sooner or later, we are going to invade the Soviet Union, smash them, take their lands, destroy their cities, kill all of their population. It's explicitly stated in there. And then we will move nice, friendly German families in there and create idyllic farming communities so that we can feed the Reich. That's the plan. It's written down for everyone to see for like 10 years. And yet the Soviets take no real notice of this. It's fascinating. Probably because they're following the realpolitik point of view. Yeah, he's blabbering off about this ideological stuff, but what he's doing is maintaining the agreement we had with the Weimar Republic of trade and training and all that, and who invades their friends, right? It's whatever. It's almost mafia-like, isn't it, right? They come as your friends to kill you when they come to kill you, right? So Hitler has this problem, though. He is in charge. We're in the 30s now, the middle, late 30s. He's got two big problems. Actually, three. The Reich cannot feed itself. It has to import food to survive. logistics. Again, you have not thought about this. The Reich does not have enough energy to do what it wants to do, to achieve its strategic long-term plans. And fuel has become fuel oil, diesel fuel, oil refineries. Germany doesn't have any of that. The Soviet Union and the United States are the world's biggest producers, and then you get Venezuela and a couple other places. The Saudis haven't even found their oil yet. So they're getting oil imported from the Soviet Union. However, they are in a race against time when it comes to creating the war machine with which they will take over the world, right? And achieve these goals of destroying the Soviet Union and putting in their own people and creating these nice little farming communities. This war is actually a war, World War II, is actually a war for energy. It is not an ideological crusade, although there's the veneer of that. There is certainly action taken on that. A lot of people got killed over it, but really, the realpolitik point of view is that this is a war about energy. And that ties into every decision that Hitler makes. He is on a race against time. Now, keep in mind what he's done over the late 30s as well. He has muscled around Europe, taken over the Sudetenland, gotten into the Anschluss with Austria. For those of you who don't know what that means, he took over pieces of other people's countries and swallowed up Austria whole into the Reich. And no one stopped him. When the deal with Sudetenland was figured out, the Czechoslovakians were left out in the hall. The British, French, German diplomats and that were in the room, the Italians. But the guys who were affected by it the most were left out in the hall to hear the decision. Churchill was not in charge of Britain at this time. It was a fellow named Neville Chamberlain. Nothing wrong with Neville. Neville had seen World War I. He did not want to see World War I again. He knew what general war meant. Now, a lot of people have viewed 20 years as a period of rearming. It's enough time to rearm before the next war. In fact, when the German submarine fleet at World War I scuttled itself at Scapa Flow in Scotland at the end of that war, they were doing so with the point of view of that we will raise these for the next war. And certainly, the actions of the Weimar Republic were to gear up for the next war, right? We'll do massive inflation and pay off this war debt, straighten our economy out with new equipment, and get ready for the next punch. And we'll train all of our guys over here where nobody's looking in the Soviet Union and get them all ready. That was the plan the entire time. Hitler just happened to come up at the apex of it. And I mean, that's oversimplifying as well, just happened to. I mean, he was the guy who made himself do it as well. So, a war for energy. At the beginning, as we're getting close to 1939, the German General Staff tells Hitler, we need a few more years here. We need a few more years to build up our units and their training and the numbers and our ships and all that stuff, right? Germany never built an aircraft carrier. Has it ever occurred to you to ask why not? It's because they decided, A, not to really be a naval power, but they also put their resources into building these giant ships, like the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. And they were actually building one. They got the hull down, but in, I think, 1944, they turned it into something else. They were like, we're not going to finish this in time. And instead, they were busy building super weapons, rockets and jets. The Germans had the first jet. So they're coming to him and saying, look, we only have enough equipment and fuel and whatnot to do this or that. And remember, again, thinking about logistics and planning and that, which you folks have not thought of before, how does a war plan get developed? And believe you me, the war plan gets developed. America has a plan to invade Canada. The Canadians have a war plan of what to do if invaded by the United States. But we're pals, we're allies. So, you plan according to capabilities, possibilities, not what's actually happening. Germany has war plans. They have two organizations, OKH and OKW, which are the units in charge. And OKH is the one that comes up with the plans. OKW is a creation of Hitler to kind of be the bean on top and control everything. And OKH gets reduced in influence throughout the war, being told, no, you're not handling the Eastern Front with the Soviet Union. Just worry about other stuff. But at the beginning, OKH is in charge, and they're the ones creating the plans. And they plan according to the capabilities that they have. And they know they've only got so much oil, energy, to fight for so long of a period. Now, at the beginning of the war, you can be optimistic. Nobody's fought anybody yet. We can all believe that, oh, we'll take over this, we'll take over that, we'll get this resource, we'll be fine. And so you're much more optimistic about what you'll be able to do. And your plans reflect that. And you'll burn a lot of fuel. When I tell you that as we get into 1941, this invasion of the Soviet Union happens that year by Nazi Germany, greatest war of all time, greatest offensive, biggest offensive. It's massive. They're blowing fuel like crazy at this point. And they have to tell their recon units, the Germans have to tell their recon units, we can't afford, we don't have the fuel to run these motorized recon units anymore. And that was a big thing for the German army, that they were the biggest, most motorized units in the world. We got to tone that down. You got to turn your recon units into bicycles. Get the guys on bicycles. They can't go around on trucks anymore, or tanks or jeeps. Send them out on bicycles. Okay. Again, a little factoid nobody knows, but it's indicative of what energy was costing. They were running out. When you go to war with your trading partner, you cut yourself off from that, right? You don't get the oil from the Soviet Union that they were buying anymore. That supply's dried up until maybe you take it over. And the Germans were very wishy-washy about what their objective was in invading the Soviet Union. Hitler initially kicked the door. All we have to do is kick the door and the whole rotten edifice will fall down. That was their belief. They had terrible intelligence, meaning they did not know what units the Soviets had and how many. Their plan was to destroy the Soviet army and take over, grab Moscow in the first place, and deny it as a resting spot for the winter. Winter starts in September in some years. Snow in September 2nd. Like, that's unfathomable to me, born in Vancouver and living in North Carolina. Like, I've never seen that. That's crazy, right? And it doesn't end probably until April or something. I mean, we had snow there was one weird day back in Vancouver where it would snow in early April, like April 5th or something like that. Every few years it would do that, and I'd be like, there's that weird day again. But over there, snow, general winter they call it, right? Because it just shuts everything down. Boom. This general is affecting things now. So then he was like, no, let's actually go down into the Caucasus mountain range where the oil fields are and take that over. That would have been the first smart move, in my opinion. You should have gone for that instead of Moscow. But he was following the ideological thing to begin with. The problem with, hey, we'll go out with our motorized units, burn all this fuel, smash the Soviet armies, and then take over and ride off into the sunset. Actually, the sunrise. This is crazy. And what happened was, because of the lack of intelligence, they didn't know what the Soviets had. They would smash and destroy that Soviet army. The problem was, there'd be another Soviet army coming over the hill. And they'd be like, what? Where'd that come from? And then they'd smash that. And then there'd be 5 more Soviet armies coming. The number of people that the Soviets raised to put into armies is astounding. And if you look in the figures of Barbarossa and that, you'll find that the Soviets outnumber them by 3 to 1 very commonly. 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 8 to 1, it's bad. And you need to attack. You should have a 3 to 1 advantage to have a good chance of succeeding in this era. In Napoleon's time, it was different, but the movement has gone to the defender in our era in the last 150 years. So, energy, big thing here. Hitler knows, if I wait around, the Soviets are rearming. We can see them. We can't see all of them, but we can see, we're talking to them, right, earlier on, before 1941. We can see they're coming up with new equipment, new tanks. They got factories. They're getting help. And we're going to have to fight them. And the longer we wait, we're going to have to fight better trained, better equipped, more Soviets. If we fight them sooner rather than later, we'll have the advantage in men, material, equipment, logistics. Make sense? This is a major factor. Now, when I tell you that the invasion of Poland had a secret clause where the Russians, the Soviets, would join in from the east a couple weeks later and take their chunk of Polish territory. So Hitler has muscled around Europe, scared the crap out of everybody, been allowed to shrug off pieces of the Versailles Treaty and openly say, we're rearming. Nobody's lifted a finger because guys like Neville Chamberlain remembered World War I and they're like, dude, we got to appease this guy somehow. We can't fight him because if we do that, millions and millions of people are going to die and our empire, British Commonwealth, will fall even to greater decay. We don't want that. You can see where he's coming from. He's not a coward. It's just those were the options that were available to him under his paradigm. So in the 30s, Hitler's running the economy by a dictatorship, right? Command and control economy, building highways, massive public works projects. Things look good. They built the Autobahn, still there today. Lots of good stuff. But he knows, and the economists know, it's unsustainable. You see, you've never thought about how do you feed a country? How do you do the math about feeding a country? There's so many mouths to feed, they need so much food per mouth over a year. Where is that going to come from? How are we going to pay for it? That's national economics. That's something I've been trained in. I got up to intermediate macroeconomic theory. I built the model of the national economy in college. When you know, if this continues, in a few years, we're not going to be able to feed our people. When you know, if this continues in a few years, we're not going to have enough energy to fight the war that we want, to get what we want, and our enemies will have armed themselves to the teeth, and the fight's going to be so much more difficult. When you are constantly feeling the political pressure of, we hate the Versailles Treaty, we're embarrassed about our position on the world, we really want to go punch the French for what they did to us and show everybody how great we really are, and they're being pumped full of that Nazi marketing all the time. You go to a cinema, you're watching Leni Riefenstahl, right? Triumph of the Will, if you don't know what that is. You're going to want to make a move. And when you realize, okay, my biggest fan is dead in Poland, I'm a fanboy, I'm not going to get the relationship that I want, we're not going to get a treaty of any kind, we're not going to be able to eat, we're not going to have fuel, everybody's afraid of us, you're going to make a decision to go, aren't you? It makes sense, doesn't it? And so you go to OKH and you say, make me a plan. What are we going to do? Let's knock out France and let's go and hit Russia. And I got this book that outlines what we're going to do. We're going to eradicate everyone over there and create farming communities so we can get fed. Slave labor doesn't hurt either. Okay, let's get started. And so I believe all these factors contributed to why he chose September 1st, 1939 as the starting point. The pressures, the understanding of logistics. He's a smart guy. For everything you can hate about Hitler, and there's a lot to hate, he was a smart guy. You can see why it's time to go. Why September 1st? Personally, I believe if you started earlier, like they just probably got out of the negotiations in April with Poland. And then they got to decide, okay, let's go to war. How are we going to do it? You got to come up with a plan, get the logistics ready, get the agreement with the Soviet Union figured out about how we're going to partition Poland. How's that going to work, right? That takes a while, and that was all figured out then, right then, in 1939, not before. And then you got to carry it out, and you need a starting point where you can make your punch, go in, finish the job, and then not get messed with for a while. Shore up your supply lines, take over, really get embedded in that territory, get your authority established, all that stuff, right? Winter. Natural barrier, as I said. So get in, do a few weeks of fighting, do your punch, and then everything shuts down for the winter. And look what happened. In the beginning, 1940, it's called the Phony War between Britain, France, and Germany. Nothing happens. Then they go in through Belgium again, and through this forest called the Ardennes, which nobody thought. The French moved their forces north to block the advance through Belgium, thinking they were going to do the Schlieffen Plan again, and left the Ardennes open, that border, because who the hell could get a tank through the forest? Nobody can do that, thought the French. Paradigm shift. Yeah, the Nazis can, the Wehrmacht can. Now, there's something to remember here too, and I just kind of made that mistake, so I want to highlight it. Not all Germans are Nazis. Not all German officers or naval officers or soldiers are Nazis. They're just doing a job. Their political masters are Nazis. And you get groups of SS that are turned into armed units with tanks that fight at Kursk, that are not actual army units. Those are political Nazi units. But the regular Joe is probably, or Gustav, or whatever you want to call him, is probably not a Nazi. He's just a guy with a rifle or driving a tank who has the job. And it's important to remember this. So they come through and outflank the French and knock them out in, I think, 10 weeks or something like that. It's not very long. Now, the key to remember there is that French roads are very good, and that matters. Because when, in 1941, Hitler turns and attacks the Soviet Union, the roads are not good. They are, in fact, dust. They are mud. They are dirt. Dirt roads are not good for German tanks. The dirt and dust gets up inside everything. The mud bogs them down. Their transmissions foul up. At Kursk, which is the biggest tank battle, and again, I'm oversimplifying it that because Kursk was actually many battles over several weeks in a very long front. A group of Panthers, which were the newest, niftiest German tank at the time, get hit by a thunderstorm in a valley, and their transmissions get water in them, and that's it for them. They don't even get to fight. Okay, that's how impactful weather is on these things. So, something to remember. So, eventually the Germans lose the war mostly because of the energy problem. They don't have enough fuel to run the operations. Even by 1941, 1939, so 1940, 1941, 2 years, less than 2 years, really 1.5 years into the war. Germany has already got to the point of not having enough fuel and having to make horrible decisions about what are we going to do? What operations are we going to run and what are we not going to run? And so, as I said at the beginning, this mental picture that I certainly had, and I think you had too, back in high school and that, of German tanks or whoever's tanks going anywhere and doing anything and driving trucks around and going wherever their masters send them is false. This is a war of energy. So, to sum up, Belgium, very important for 200 years, right? Okay? Food. Germany cannot feed itself. Not even with slave labor. Something to think about, too, is the view of women in Nazi Germany as opposed to in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, everybody works, right? We all know that. The Soviet women were sent to the factories and told to crank out parts, and they fought, right? We all know about the witches division, right, of women bombers. But in Nazi Germany, women were regarded as these sacred, set aside, kept safe things that do not fight or go to work. They stay at home, and we protect them, that kind of thing, right? That was the Nazi point of view. And think about what that means in terms of workforce and output. The Soviets were able to get a whole lot more output. I mean, they would make a giant factory during the night. It didn't exist there. Brick. Factory is up, and 10,000 people are going to work there tomorrow. I'm not exaggerating. These are facts. This happened, right? It's astounding to think about what happened there. So, war for food, war for energy primarily, and that political climate in which, hey, as Hitler, you've muscled around everybody. They're all bowing to you, kowtowing to you, trying to not upset you. And you know you're in a race against time, against your enemies, where you've got the I mean, by the time the war started, Germany's equipment was actually outdated. And this is the weird thing, because if you get a picture of a German soldier of the time and compare him to another soldier, like a Romanian soldier or a Greek soldier or something like that, Dan Carlin talks about this in one of his podcasts. I'm going to steal this bit. He looks like some futuristic super soldier, the German soldier. He's got equipment, you don't even know what it is. And that's outdated by 1939. When the Soviet Union and Germany clash, and there's this millions upon millions of men fighting millions upon millions of men collision, bang, and it's exhausting and they stop. Germany has to rearm. They have to rearm, and you'll see a major change in equipment. This is where submachine guns come from. Fights are no longer requiring rifles, low rate of fire at long distances, right? We now need a lot of lead thrown out at short distances because we're doing house-to-house fighting. That's where the submachine gun comes from. And the tanks. Fancy new tanks, because they ran into Soviet Union. The Soviet units, tanks, this is digression, but I'm enjoying it anyway. The Soviets had World War I era tanks that were terrible, all the way up, because they never threw anything away, all the way up to the modern new, like T-34s and that the Germans would encounter and go, what the hell is this? And their shells would bounce off these Soviet tanks. Imagine what that feels like. It's wild. It must be wild, right? And so they had to go back to the drawing board and come up with some stuff that would be able to take that on. And the Soviets actually won the war with an anti-tank gun. They made tons of this cheap anti-tank gun and put it everywhere, and that's the major weapon that won the war for them. But meanwhile, Nazi Germany in 1941, 1942, with its dwindling resources and ability to get anything done and having to make harsh choices, has to go back to the drawing board and come up with new weapon systems that require intense machine tooling and that. A resource they don't have much of, right? Less all the time. So based on my last year of research, those are my main reasons for why World War II started on September 1st, 1939, not 6 months before, because they were still embroiled in negotiations with Poland for a potential defensive pact. They were just being done muscling around Europe and getting some concessions, and maybe we're thinking about it, right? They were in that situation of pressure where they knew time was running out, that they were going to keep running out of fuel and food, and their enemies were going to rearm and get to parity, and they had to go. Thanks for listening.